Honestly, I think that I was just trying to avoid it, pretending like these issues didn't exist. And then once those issues slap you in the face, you really have no choice but to come to terms with what's really going on. And so I'm just going to be 100% honest. I mean, I remember when the BLM protests began in 2020. Obviously, in the beginning, I was very supportive of those protests, but every night they would quickly devolve into riots. And I remember messaging with friends, even messaging with colleagues about being fearful because, where I live is very close, like walking distance to, a main boulevard where a lot of the rioting took place. And on one hand, here I am in my personal life, seeing the injustice of all of these small, in my community, Latino-owned businesses being completely.
Anna Kasparian just dropped a bombshell, and the left is scrambling to contain it. For years, she was a staple of progressive media, a fierce voice on the Young Turks, defending left-wing policies and challenging conservatives. But now, she's done playing along. In a raw and unfiltered takedown, Kasparian is calling out the hypocrisy, censorship, and ideological purity tests that have taken over modern leftist spaces. From the riots of 2020 to the pressures of audience capture, she's exposing how progressive media silences its own, and she's not holding back. If you've ever wondered why so many leftists are afraid to speak their minds, this is something you need to hear.
Form our property and commercial property tax code in California, which people don't know this. We have very high sales taxes, very high income taxes, but like almost a medieval commercial tax property situation with Prop 13. Try to reform that, they call you a racist. So it's taking this language from the social justice left to the point where none of these words seem to mean anything. They're used by the oligarchs, by the people in power. And it took me, I have kind of had an incremental march here from writing for The Nation, writing for kind of more institutional left-wing outlets to, I still have a lot of these values. I have a lot of these beliefs and concerns, but I feel I'm with you. The Unaligned is a great Substack name, by the way, because I feel unaligned. Could you tell me talk a little bit about your journey? Like what were there certain moments where you said, what's going on here?
So a lot of different things happened. And, I think there's this misconception that a few things happened to me personally, and that was all it took for me to, have a reactionary response. And that is not the case. Those personal things that happened to me forced me to come to terms with some very real flaws that I was seeing on the left. But honestly, I think that I was just trying to avoid it, pretending like these issues didn't exist. And then once those issues slap you in the face, you really have no choice but to come to terms with what's really going on. And so I'm just going to be 100% honest. I mean, I remember when the BLM protests began in 2020. Obviously, in the beginning, I was very supportive of those protests, but every night they would quickly devolve into riots. And I remember messaging with friends, even messaging with colleagues about being fearful because, where I live is very close, like walking distance to, a main boulevard where a lot of the rioting took place. And on one hand, here I am in my personal life, seeing the injustice of all of these small, in my community, Latino-owned businesses being completely crushed. They lose everything, right? And of course, there's this BS excuse of, they have.
Anna Kasparian's shift away from the progressive left is a story of ideological disillusionment that many former leftists can relate to. Initially, she fully supported the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, believing in their core mission of addressing systemic racial injustices. However, as the protests devolved into riots night after night, she was forced to confront a harsh reality. While the national conversation focused on police brutality, her local community bore the brunt of the destruction. Small businesses, many owned by Latino immigrants, were ransacked, looted, and left in ruins. Yet when she voiced concern over this devastation, she faced an impossible choice: remain silent to avoid being labeled a racist, or speak the truth and risk professional and social ostracization. For too long, she suppressed her growing unease, but the contradictions within the movement became impossible to ignore. Her realization wasn't rooted in personal grievances, but in witnessing firsthand how progressive rhetoric often ignored the real-world consequences of its actions. Kasparian's revelations go beyond policy failures. She exposes a deeper, more insidious reality within progressive media: audience capture. Many left-wing commentators, she argues, do not genuinely believe the narratives they push. Figures like Destiny, David Pacman, and Hassan Piker, she suggests, are keenly aware that breaking from progressive orthodoxy would mean losing subscribers, sponsorships, and credibility within their ideological bubble. This dynamic traps many leftist media figures in an echo chamber, where questioning key tenets, whether about criminal justice, gender ideology, or economic policy, leads to immediate backlash. Kasparian does not believe these commentators are unintelligent. Rather, they are constrained by the incentives that come with maintaining a loyal following. The pursuit of truth takes a backseat to ideological conformity, creating a media landscape where dissent is punished and self-censorship is the norm.
Cares, right? But no, it's not that simple. Okay. But, watching my own community fall apart and then going on my show, and if I'm completely honest, like terrified of even bringing any of that up, because I understood the injustice and agreed that something needed to be done about the injustice toward George Floyd and individuals like him. But I was also terrified that if I brought up things like riots, I would automatically be assumed to be some sort of hateful bigot or racist. And I'm just not. I just see the damage that's being done to my community and communities across the country as all of this is going on. So I dealt with that conflict for a little while, and I felt pretty disgusted with myself because I want to be honest with the audience, but there was also some self-preservation involved because I didn't want people to do to me what they're doing now, actually. And then finally, it just got to a point where I couldn't take it anymore. Like, I saw what was happening and I needed to be honest about it. Obviously, things happened to me as well. But more importantly, there was a disconnect between progressive policymakers and legislators and what their constituents wanted. And they just ignored their own constituents. A perfect example.
Beyond the dynamics of media, Kasparian highlights the disconnect between progressive politicians and the very people they claim to represent. She singles out Representative Ilhan Omar as a prime example of this hypocrisy. Despite the Black community in Omar's district explicitly opposing efforts to defund the police, she and other progressive leaders pushed forward with a policy anyway, driven more by ideological commitment than by the actual needs of their constituents. Similarly, Kasparian discusses the backlash against Armenian and immigrant parents in Glendale, California, who opposed aspects of the gender curriculum in public schools. Rather than engaging in dialogue, Democratic politicians and progressive activists immediately smeared them as fascists and bigots. This kind of knee-jerk demonization, she argues, reveals a fundamental problem with today's left. It is more invested in moral grandstanding than in truly representing the concerns of working-class and minority communities.
Representative Ilhan Omar from Minnesota. So her district demanded that they do not defund the police. Okay? The Black community said, we don't want you to defund the police. There is a higher crime rate. We are worried about it. We do not want you to cut funding for police. The vast majority of them did not want that. Okay. Ilhan Omar went forward with advocating for defunding the police anyway. And I was just like, okay, well, who are we representing here? Are we actually representing marginalized communities, or are we just representing what our cause believes to be right, despite what those communities desire?
Another example that's even closer to home for you, which is which I just think is wild, is like, do you remember about a year ago in Glendale, there were all these parents who were protesting the gender curriculum at Glendale public schools, and Glendale is a largely Armenian, but also just immigrant-based community. It's like, probably middle-class immigrants. I did go down and report on it. I didn't take the time to talk to these parents or anything. So this is just casually observing as a news consumer. But whatever you think about their critique about the curriculum, these were just parents protesting what they saw as the shortcomings of the education of their own children. And like, Gavin Newsom, Adam Schiff represents Glendale, doesn't he? He represents Pasadena and I think part of Glendale.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
They're like going on Twitter and calling them fascists and comparing them to Nazis. And I'm just like, it was like flabbergasting because I was like, these are your voters.
In contrast to those trapped by ideological conformity, Kasparian praises figures like Joe Rogan and Russell Brand for breaking free from progressive orthodoxy. Unlike leftist commentators who continue pandering to their base, these figures have chosen to follow the truth wherever it leads, even at the cost of losing audience support. Kasparian acknowledges the risks involved in this decision but ultimately sees it as necessary. Those who dare to question the dominant progressive narrative are quickly labeled misogynists, racists, or reactionaries, making it difficult for independent thinkers to challenge the movement from within. However, she believes that truth-seeking should take precedence over appeasing an audience and respects those who, like her, are willing to walk away from ideological constraints in pursuit of honest discourse. Kasparian's break from the left is emblematic of a larger phenomenon, an increasing number of progressives who find themselves alienated by the movement's intolerance for dissent. The modern left, she argues, is no longer about debating ideas or addressing the concerns of everyday people. Instead, it has become a self-righteous crusade where ideological purity matters more than real-world outcomes. The pressure to conform is immense, and those who refuse to toe the line are swiftly cast out. However, Kasparian sees this moment as an opportunity. By speaking out, she is not just challenging her former allies, she is encouraging others to do the same. The question now is whether more voices will follow her lead or if the progressive left will continue its descent into an echo chamber of self-delusion. Either way, her story serves as a warning. Any movement that cannot tolerate internal criticism is doomed to fail.